In the heart of the Egyptian desert, silence ruled for 6 long years. Since the crushing defeat of 1967, Egypt had been living with a wound that refused to heal. The loss of Sinai, the humiliation, and the painful echo of promises broken. The Suez Canal, once a symbol of life and pride, had become a line of sorrow, driving not just the land, but the soul of the nation. On the western bank stood Egyptian soldiers, young and determined, staring every day across the water at an enemy that believed Egypt would never rise again. The world had written Egypt off, calling it defeated, weak, finished. But beneath the quiet surface, something powerful was building. A secret that would soon shake the entire Middle East. In the hidden rooms in Cairo, President Anwar El Sadat and his closest generals were planning something the world would never expect. They called it Operation Badr, named after the first great battle in Islamic history where the few defeated the mighty. It wasn't just a plan of war, but a mission of dignity, for redemption, for history itself. Egypt's engineers had discovered a way to break Israel's so-called Bar-Lev Line, not with bombs, but with the force of water itself. And as October the 6th, 1973 approached, a quiet fire burned in the heart of every Egyptian soldier. When the clock struck 2 that afternoon, Egypt would rise from the ashes of defeat, and the silence that haunted the nation for 6 years would finally be broken by the thunder of war and cry of victory. But how did Egypt manage to deceive one of the most powerful intelligence systems in the world? How did its soldiers cross what was believed to be an impossible barrier? And how did this daring war lead not only to victory on the battlefield, but to return of Sinai itself? Stay with me, because this is the untold story of how Egypt turned humiliation into triumph and changed the course of the Middle East history forever. This is Denzel speaking. Welcome to the world of intrigue. Do not forget to subscribe in the channel and hit the like button for more secrets to get revealed. Now let's get started. After the smoke of 1967 had cleared, Egypt stood at a crossroads. The dream of Arab unity had collapsed, and millions of Egyptians were left questioning their future. The army was wounded, not only in numbers but in spirit. For years, soldiers stood along the canal watching the enemy's flag fly on the other side, waiting for the day they could cross again. When President Anwar Sadat took power in 1970 after the death of Jamal Abdel Nasser, many doubted him. Some saw him as too quiet, too gentle to lead a nation still bleeding from war. But Sadat had something far more dangerous than anger, patience, and vision. He understood that Egypt did not just need weapons, it needed to believe again. And step by step, he began rebuilding what was lost. He brought in loyal, brilliant minds like General Ahmed Ismail Ali, a man known for his calm under fire, as Minister of War, and Lieutenant General Saad Chazli, a strategic genius who would soon become the architect of victory. Sadat focused on morale as much as on machinery. He visited the troops, listened to their fears. He reminded them that Egypt's dignity was not gone. It was only waiting for the right moment to return. While the world thought Egypt was weak, Sadat played a game of deception. He opened the doors to diplomacy, pretending to seek peace while secretly preparing for war. He ordered large-scale training under the disguise of military exercise. Soviet-made MiG aircraft filled the skies again, and Egypt's air defense network grew stronger every month. The message was clear. Egypt was no longer a defeated nation. But still, Sadat knew one truth. He couldn't fight Israel alone. He needed unity, and so he reached out to Syria, President Hafez al-Assad back there in that time, forming an alliance that would soon strike again, north and south, one a day that would surprise the entire world. By 1972, the Egyptian army was no longer the same force that had been defeated 6 years earlier. Its soldiers were sharper, its weapons newer, and its leadership hungrier. But still, Israel believed Egypt would never dare to attack again. That false confidence became Egypt's greatest weapon. Behind the closed doors of military command, President Anwar Sadat and his general worked in silence. General Ahmed Ismail Ali, the Minister of War, led the effort with discipline and secrecy. Beside him, Chief of Staff Saad Shazli, a man known for his cool mind and creative strategies, was crafting a plan so daring, so unexpected, that it would later be studied in military academies around the whole world. The plan was called Operation Badr, named after the first great battle of Islam, where faith and strategy defeated overwhelming odds. Its goal was clear: cross the Suez Canal, break through the Bar-Lev Line, and establish a strong bridgehead inside Sinai. Egypt did not plan to occupy all of Sinai at once. Sadat knew that would be too risky. The real aim was psychological: to destroy the myth of Israeli invincibility and prove that Egypt could fight and win. The Bar-Lev Line was Israel's pride, a chain of fortified bunkers, tanks, and high sand ramparts stretching more than 150 kilometers along the canal. Israeli generals bragged that it would take an army at least a week and 20,000 lives to cross it, but the Egyptians found a solution so simple it seemed impossible. In a hidden lab in Cairo, Egyptian engineers and officers experimented for months looking for a way to cut through the massive sand walls. Explosives were risky. They would alert the enemy. Bulldozers were too slow. Then one young engineer had an idea that sounded almost ridiculous: use water. By using high-pressure water pumps from the canal itself, the army could literally blast the sand walls away, carving a path for tanks and soldiers within hours. The generals tested, and it worked. The Bar-Lev Line would no longer be a wall, it would be a mirage. But technology was only half of the plan. The other half was deception. Sadat and his generals orchestrated one of the most brilliant misinformation campaigns in modern warfare. Egypt repeatedly mobilized its army under the excuse of training exercises. Israeli intelligence saw it so many times that by 1973 they stopped paying attention. They thought Egypt was simply pretending to prepare for war again. Meanwhile, the rear preparation went on total secrecy. Bridges and pontoons were built and hidden. Soldiers were trained to cross the canal in under 6 minutes. Pilots practiced flying so low that Israeli radars couldn't detect them. The timing of the attack was calculated to the minute. Every step, every move, every breath had its place in the plan. Even the date and hour of the assault were chosen with precision. October the 6th, 1973, a Saturday, the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur, when most Israeli soldiers would be fasting and praying. On the same day, Muslims were observing the holy month of Ramadan, a moment of faith and unity across Egypt. The symbolism was powerful: one nation praying for peace, the other caught off guard by war. The secrecy went so deep that only a handful of people knew the full picture. Even many officers thought it was just another drill until the final hours. But in the hearts of those who did know, there was a mix of fear, pride, and determination. They knew what was coming, a battle that would decide the fate of Egypt for generations. In the early days of October, the order was finally given. Army units took their positions. The canal shimmered under the afternoon sun, quiet and deceptive. On the western bank, thousands of soldiers waited, each one knowing that in a matter of hours, history would turn. Some wrote letters home, others prayed silently, starting across the water and staring across the water that had divided them from their homeland. President Sadat watched the final preparations with a heavy but hopeful heart. He knew that the cost of war would be high, but he also knew that dignity had a price. Egypt could not live forever in the shadow of 1967. The time had come to rise, to strike, to reclaim what was lost. And so, with the plan in place and the word unaware, Egypt stood ready for the moment that would change everything. The countdown to October the 6th had begun. The day was calm, the sky clear, and the sun burned over the still waters of the Suez Canal. It was 2 o'clock p.m., October the 6th, 1973, the moment Egypt had been waiting for. For 6 long years, silence had hung over the canal. Now, the silence was about to be shattered forever. Without warning, the desert rolled to life. More than 200 Egyptian aircraft thundered across the sky, flying so low they almost touched the dunes. In less than 60 minutes, they struck deep in Sinai, destroying Israeli radar stations, command posts, and the ammunition depot. The first wave of the Operation Badr had begun. At the very second, on the western bank of the canal, tens of thousands of Egyptian soldiers waited for a signal, and when the code words came, Bismillah, Allahu Akbar, and that means God is great, the men surged forward. Rubber boats hit the water, and the canal that once divided Egypt became the bridge to its rebirth. The Israelis were stunned. It was Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, and their defense were thin. Within minutes, Egyptian commandos reached the eastern bank, raising the flag of Egypt on enemy soil for the first time since 1967. The impossible had just happened. Behind them, engineers worked with precision and courage, using powerful water pumps that blasted holes through the 18-meter-high sand walls of the Bar-Lev Line. What Israel once called impenetrable was collapsing like wet paper. Within 6 hours, the first Egyptian tanks rolled across floating bridges into Sinai. By nightfall, 5 full Egyptian divisions, nearly 80,000 soldiers, had crossed the canal. They captured dozens of enemy strongholds, destroyed tanks, and pushed 15 kilometers deep into the eastern bank. When Israeli reinforcement finally reached, it was already too late. Egypt had broken through. Across Cairo and the Arab world, streets erupted in celebration. People cried, prayed, and hugged in disbelief. After years of humiliation, Egypt had struck back and won the first day. That night, as President Sadat looked at the reapers pouring in, he knew what every Egyptian now felt. Egypt was no longer the defeated. It was the nation that dared to rise again. The morning after the crossing, the entire Arab world was celebrating, but inside the war rooms of Tel Aviv, panic had turned into fury. Israel's generals, shocked and humiliated, were now preparing for revenge. Their leader, Prime Minister Gold Meir, ordered full counterattack. Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, once the symbol of Israeli power, now admitted the situation is very serious. The Egyptians have done what we thought was impossible. But Israel still had one advantage: massive support from the United States. Within days, American planes began airlifting tanks, ammunition, and spare parts straight into the war zone under Operation Nickel Grass. The balance was shifting again. Meanwhile, President Anwar El Sadat watched the battle unfold with pride and caution. His generals reported strong positions across the canal, protected by Egypt's power air defense network. And for the first time, Israeli Air Force, the same one that destroyed Egypt's planes on the ground in 1967, was being shot down in numbers. Egyptian missiles filled the skies, turning the eastern bank into a deadly trap. But war is never predictable. While Egypt was holding firm, Syria, fighting in the north on the Golan Heights, was under heavy Israeli attack. Sadat faced a painful choice: stay defensive and secure Egypt's victory, or push deeper into Sinai to help his Syrian allies against the advice of General Saad Eshazli, who warned that advancing beyond the missile umbrella would expose the army. Sadat chose to move forward. It was a decision that would change the course of the war. On October 14th, Egypt launched a new offensive toward the Metella and Gidi passes. Deep in the desert, the result was devastating. Israeli jets and tanks ambushed the advancing Egyptian force in one open ground. The desert became a furnace of fire and steel. Hundreds of Egyptian tanks were hit, The Israeli army, led by General Ariel Sharon, spotted a weak point between Egypt's second and third army, a narrow gap near the Great Bitter Lake. What happened next was chaos. Sharon, bold and reckless, crossed the canal westward through the gap, bringing the battle onto Egyptian soil. The hunter had become the hunted. Now, the Third Army was trapped in Sinai, encircled by Israeli forces, its supplies lines cut. Cairo felt the shock immediately. Sadat's command centers buzzed with confusion and urgency. Some ministers feared disaster, but the Egyptian soldiers on the ground refused to surrender. They fought with desperate courage, holding the lines under relentless airstrikes and tank fire. Even as the situation worsened, their spirit did not break. They had already proved the world wrong once, and they would not give up the victory they had earned. As the desert burned, the world watched in alarm. Both in the United States and the Soviet Union raised their nuclear alert levels, fearing the conflict could spiral into a world war. The Middle East stood on the edge of catastrophe. Yet in the midst of fire and chaos, one truth remained. Egypt had changed the rules of the game, even if the tide had turned temporary. The myth of Israeli invincibility was gone forever. But the third week of October 1973, the war had reached its breaking point. Both sides had suffered heavy losses. The Sinai desert was filled with smoke, broken tanks, and the echoes of battles that changed the whole world. Egypt had shocked everyone, but the cost was high. Thousands of brave soldiers had fallen, and both armies were exhausted. On the last days of the war, the situation became tense. Israeli forces managed to cross the canal from the west, surrounding part of Egypt's Third Army near Suez City. Supplies were running low, and the soldiers were trapped, but even then, they refused to surrender. They held their positions, proud and strong, waiting for the orders from Cairo. President Anwar El Sadat was under huge pressure. The Americans and the Soviets were calling him every hour, warning that if the fighting did not stop, the war could turn into something much bigger, even a global disaster. Sadat made a brave decision. On October 2022, Egypt agreed to a ceasefire following a United Nations resolution. But the fighting did not stop right away. Each side blamed the other for breaking the truce. It took a few more days before the guns finally went silent. When the war ended, the situation on the ground was complicated. Israel had surrounded part of the Egyptian army, but it had also lost control of its sphere. The world now saw that Israel was untouchable, and Egypt had regained its pride. The Egyptian flag was flying again on the eastern bank of the Suez Canal, and that for every Egyptian was a symbol stronger than any map line. In months that followed, negotiations began, first under tension, then under hope. Sadat stood firm. Egypt would not rest until Sinai was returned, and although the military battles had stopped, a new kind of battle had begun, a political one. 5 years later, the fight led to one of the boldest moves in modern history. In 1978, Sadat flew to Jerusalem and spoke to the Israeli parliament, shocking the world again. A year later, Egypt signed the Camp David Accords, and in 1982, the final goal was achieved. Sinai was returned to Egypt. The War of 1973 was not only about land, it was about dignity, courage, and the rebirth of a nation. Egypt had proven that even after defeat, it could rise, fight, and win its place back in history. The guns finally fell silent, but the echo of the 1973 war still lives in every Egyptian heart. It wasn't just a battle of tanks and planes. It was a battle for respect, for dignity, for the soul of a nation. After years of loss and silence, Egypt proved that courage and unity could change the course of history. Yet, the road after the war wasn't easy. There were politics, negotiations, and moments of doubt, but Egypt never gave up. In 1982, after long talks and international pressure, the dream finally became real. Sinai returned home. Egypt's soldiers marched again on their own land, not as conquerors, but as guardians of peace and honor. When you stand today at the banks of the Suez Canal and look across the water, you don't just see sand or bridges, you see the story of sacrifice. You see the faces of young men who fought with faith, with love for their country, and with a dream that Egypt would never kneel again. The War of October 1973 was more than a military victory. It was a message to the world that Egypt might bend, but it will never break. It can be wounded, but it will always rise. So tonight, as we look back on the war, let's ask ourselves, what made those men cross the canal knowing they might never return? Was it revenge, or was it something deeper? And today, do we still carry the same spirit, the spirit that made Egypt rise from the ashes and take back its land? Because history may fade with time, but pride, courage, and the name of Egypt will never die.